Well, on behalf of everybody at the Unstuck Group, we want to welcome you to today's webinar on healthy multi-site expansion and specifically adding more campuses without getting stuck. My name is Sean. I'm the Director of Operations and a consultant here at the Unstuck Group. And before we get started, let me introduce you to the team that I have with me here today. First of all, I have my teammate, Amy Anderson. Amy has served as the Director of Consulting at the Unstuck Group since 2016. During that time, she's served over 150 churches, helping them with ministry strategy, staffing, and their multi-site strategy, just to align their team and fuel their mission forward. Amy, it's great to have you here.
Yeah, so great to be here today, Sean. And I love this topic. You know, I can still remember when we launched our third campus, which was really the first intentional new location that we launched because we had stumbled into two locations kind of by accident. But the third was 18 months into the planning, and it was a merger, or we call that an acquisition behind the scenes. And the church was down to about 80 people. And we opened those doors that first Sunday morning, wondering if anyone would come. And we ended up in a turnaway situation because of all the people that actually showed up, and it was unbelievable. And I remember standing in the front of the worship center thinking, I think we're onto something here. And that experience just solidified our expansion strategy was going to be multi-site, not a bigger building anymore.
That's good. Yeah. I also have my friend Paul Alexander here with us today. Paul has more than 28 years experience serving in the local church, the last 23 of which have been on the senior leadership teams of some of the nation's leading megachurches. Currently, Paul is serving as the executive pastor at Sun Valley Community Church, a large multi-site church located in the Phoenix area. Paul, it's great to have you here with us too.
Yeah, Sean, I'm super glad to be able to hang out with you guys today. Hopefully the conversation's helpful for people who are joining us. You know, like Amy, when we made the decision to go multi-site 14 years ago, our original location was actually landlocked on 10 acres, one entrance, one exit, no room to expand. We were full. We were maximizing that footprint, doing 5 services. I mean, I guess we could have done 7 or 9, but the diminishing return of it all, you know, it felt like we went multi-site because we had to. To be able to continue to be faithful to the mission that Jesus gave us to reach people and introduce new people to Jesus. We had done church planting and sent people out, but we felt like we had a culture that was worth replicating. And so really felt like in order to be faithful to the calling the Lord put on our life as a church and mission was we did it because we had to. And so now some years later, almost quadrupled in size, and what felt like this incredible risk when we did it the first time out of the gate now has turned into really incredible spiritual fruit with literally thousands of more people meeting Jesus this year. We'll baptize over 1,500 people. And in a lot of ways, in a lot of ways, it feels like we're just kind of getting started.
Yeah. Well, Amy, I wonder if you could just get us started in this conversation by why exactly we decided this was the topic for today.
Yeah, really, we're responding to the data that we analyzed last month for our Q4 edition of the Unstuck Church Report. We surveyed more than 100 multi-site churches in October, and we found that 41% are actively planning to add another campus in the next 12 months. And that is really exciting. These churches are growing. Like you, Paul, they're running out of space and wanting to reach more people in their surrounding areas. But expansion can get churches stuck. And we've seen the predictable mistakes that get made when you're adding a third or a fourth campus. So we want to help you avoid that.
Absolutely, yeah. You know, our team here at the Unstuck Group, we have more than 100 combined years of experience serving multi-site churches. And we've seen all the distinct ways that multi-site can actually wreck a church. So we're going to share some of that hard-earned wisdom and some of the best practices today. So here's what we want to encourage you to do, and specifically the decision to make today. If you're thinking about multi-site expansion in the next 12 months, we hope that by the end of the event today that you'll feel committed to doing a multi-site health assessment first before you get into the weeds of campus launch planning, okay? So we're going to break this conversation today into 4 parts. First of all, the assumptions and anxieties about adding campuses. Secondly, how leadership and structure evolve with each new campus. Third, navigating tricky decision-making as your church grows. And then lastly, best practices for when you need to add a campus fast. A few more details before we get started in the content. We're going to have chat and live Q&A, or chat and Q&A open. in the Zoom window, like always. So you can submit your questions there, make comments about the content, just engage with us and our team through live Q&A and chat. If you haven't yet, we have a companion workbook that you can download to go along with today's conversation. You can grab that at the unstuckgroup.com/workbook, the unstuckgroup.com/workbook. And then if you'd like to share anything from today's conversation on social media, you can do that with the hashtag UnstuckChurch on X, formerly Twitter, or Facebook. Engage with us there. Use that hashtag UnstuckChurch. All right, I want to get right to it because we've got a lot to talk about. Let's kick off the conversation with some of the anxieties that church leaders can feel when they think about expansion, and maybe some of the bad assumptions that they can make. So generally, multi-site churches who are launching into campus 3 or 4 tell me they don't know what they don't know right now. Most have not been involved in a church of that size before or with that many locations.
Yeah, that's right, Sean. And here are some of the anxieties for current multi-site churches that are expanding, some of the anxieties that they have. One of them is, do we actually have the bench of leaders and people to actually launch another location? Meaning they often feel like they're already stretched thin, or they were just starting to feel comfortable again after the last launch. So we're just not sure, they say, that we have all the people we need to pull this off. Second, there's some anxieties around, will our culture hold up as we launch this additional campus? Will we transfer our DNA? Because we know when we launch a new campus, we have to add staff to our team, right? So we're going to have to hire some people who can launch this new location. And of course, you'll send some veterans with them as well. But new people have varying levels of experience at other multi-site churches. And some of them bring baggage, and maybe baggage you didn't sniff out in the interview process. So the underlying fear is just messing with the healthy team maybe that you've created, the environment, because you put a lot of energy into it. A third anxiety is, are we multiplying the right thing? I think most pastors admit, while they have strengths as a church, they also have areas they're not winning right now. For instance, so they're growing, which is great, so we need to make more room, but they're stuck around things like leadership development, their leadership pipeline, identifying future leaders. Some of them have some wrong people in the wrong roles, and so multiplying that feels risky. Or maybe the worst anxiety, they already had a bad experience with one of their other launches with a campus pastor. Maybe that didn't work out the way they thought they would, and now they're feeling just a little bit gun shy. And, I remember when we were trying to identify our campus pastor for our third location. So, and again, this is the first intentional launch that we did. The other one, we had moved and then had to reopen our original location. But we waffled. We had 2 candidates. We waffled between this known staff member who had high character, high chemistry, and just had this shepherd's heart and gifting. The other guy was a former lead pastor who just didn't want to preach anymore, but wanted to lead a local body. And he had shepherding gifts, but he was more of a leader shepherd than a pastor shepherd. The problem was he lived several states away, and beyond his son who attended our church, we really didn't know him. And we had a lot of anxiety over this decision. We felt like we know this person, but this one's more wired for what we need, and who is the better choice? So those were some of them that come to mind. Paul, what would you add?
Yeah, I think especially in those early days, we operated under some assumptions and some anxieties, the tension of both of those things back and forth. I mean, the reality is no church goes into this thinking, we want to do this wrong. And right. So everything they're doing because they think it's the right move. No one comes to work every day and says, I really want to screw things up today at the job. So, but we definitely made some mistakes in those early days. We just thought, like, in one situation, we're just going to do what we do over there at this new place, and it's just automatically going to work. Mm-hmm. And in one of the mergers that we went through in those early days, you so kindly used the term acquisition, we underestimated the power of culture that was already there at that church. And we learned the hard way that people transfer culture, ministry programs and guidelines and practices, they may support them and undergird them and maybe even help institutionalize them quite a bit. But really, it's your staff and your people that are already a part of that local church that you're sending to that new location that transfer the culture. And we actually, one culture had to win out over the other one when it came to that whole merger situation. Something that we assumed and learned the hard way as well, just people left, they'd go to a new location. And if that location didn't look and feel and smell like Sun Valley, if even the weekend experience wasn't consistent, I don't just mean like the worship experience and the preaching, but the vibe of the room, the vibe of the lobby, the crowdedness of the experience, people came right back. They went and were like, hey, it's Sun Valley, go. And they went because we had enough trust built up over time. They followed our leadership. But then the next week they came back and they're like, well, that's not Sun Valley. And they weren't wrong. And so we had to listen to that learning and change. I think another thing that we underestimated was the loss of the original Sunding campus, Amy. And Sean, we sent great volunteers, really good leaders, people that had been around Sun Valley for years and carried the culture to that new location. And we underestimated the loss that would be experienced on that Sunding campus. Just relational loss, the leadership loss of those volunteers, the leadership loss of those staff. And Amy, you alluded to this whole idea about the bench. Do we have the bench to pull this off? And we were super ambitious out of the gate. We went from one location to 3 locations in about a 12-month period.
Oh, wow.
I don't recommend that. We learned a lot of lessons the hard way, right? And so everybody who was part-time became full-time. Everybody was transferring to different campuses. We used to joke around those early days, if you don't like your job at Sun Valley, hold your breath for 30 minutes. It's probably going to change. And some people love that, but most people don't. And so it kind of felt like the wheels were a little wobbly. And all of a sudden we cleared our bench because we elevated everybody and sent them to these locations. And we looked back at our bench and we said, oh goodness, this Multisite has a tendency to expose what's already there. Just like crisis, when it happens in our lives, it's too late to prepare. It happens and exposes what's there. Multisite will expose, both in a good way and a bad way, it'll shine a light on your leadership development engine that you have at your church. And it'll either confirm what you think, that it's going really well, or it'll expose that you may have some ground to take. And we learned we had some ground to take.
Yep. Yeah. As you're talking, Paul, in this umbrella, under this umbrella of assumptions, because we've done it before, so we're assuming it's going to go that well again. I think one last thing to avoid getting stuck is you just need to make sure you're not assuming things that were healthy when you launched your last campus are still healthy enough today to launch another one. And so I just want to show our participants one of the tools that we use when we are doing a multi-site assessment to see if churches are ready to expand or expand again. And so you can see these checkpoints. There's 10 of them here. These are the areas we talk through in detail and kind of rate that red, yellow, or green. So we help them determine things like their leadership capacity. You can see that one on there, their volunteer strength, their financial strength. And that discussion, when you gather 8 to 12 leaders and talk about the health in these areas, it brings a soberness to the preparation, maybe a reminder if you're doing it again, the preparation that's needed to launch a healthy campus and sustain the locations you already have. So measuring health in multi-site churches is just more complex than if you're a single site location. For future expansion, yes, you need growth, but you need more than that. You need financial strength, but you need more than that. So each time you're thinking about another launch, you need to assess the replicability. Is that a word? The replicability?
It is now.
Yeah, of your multi-site model. I make them up all the time. You have to assess the model and the operations in these 10 critical areas, and we help churches do that.
That's good. Well, early in the health assessment phase of our multi-site Unstuck process, we facilitate that group session with church leadership teams, kind of tease out those anxieties and assumptions in the room about continuing to expand. And it's a really healthy conversation to have before the strategic planning, the strategic multi-site planning begins. And it's critical that you challenge the assumptions that you've made along the way that have maybe not proven true. So before we move on, take just a moment and reflect. We've left you some space in your workbook to jot a few things down. What are the big questions or concerns weighing on your mind about adding more campuses? And if you're up for that, maybe share one of those questions or concerns in chat as we do. So we're going to give you about 30 seconds. Write those down in your workbook, and then we're back with conversation 2. Okay, so let's get into the practical aspects of how leadership and structure evolve with each new campus. Amy, start us off. What changes structurally with each new campus? Maybe you can give some examples from, when we move from 2 to 3 campuses, 3 to 4, 4 to 5, and talk us through a few of your org charts.
Yeah, actually, I want to pull up a chart here. This is called Multisite Stages, and these are just some of the principles you need to think about. What changes as you get into deeper multi-site. And so it may feel basic, but I'm just going to walk through it here. When we look at the roles, when you are one site, pretty much everyone on your team has a role. When you get into these 2 to 3 sites, when you have 2 to 3 locations, this is where dual roles emerge, right? So we start to introduce language like campus and central, influence and authority. So a lot of your leaders are going to have a central responsibility and then a campus responsibility. And this is also a season where we start to really recognize just the importance of our reliance on volunteers to do ministry. And then when we get to 4 or more sites, and part of this isn't a firm line, because if you launch 4 campuses that are 200 or 300 people, you won't get to this place yet. But if you're launching larger locations, this is typically where people get back to a singular role. So instead of being campus and central, they're typically now campus or central. And again, now we're a high reliance on volunteers, but I have to add the word leader there, because this is where that flywheel of giving ministry away to those volunteer leaders really starts to hum and kick into gear. This attenders one, I'll go quick. Obviously, when you're one site, we're all at one location. 2 to 3 sites, the primary audience is still at the original location. But somewhere around that 4+ sites, and I say this really for lead pastors to remember this, about that time, 50% of the people that are attending your church are actually attending on the other side of that camera. So the reason I mention it is that I think lead pastors sometimes, because they're always teaching and present at the sending campus, sometimes they can forget that they're a multi-site church, and other leaders around him or her need to remind them of that. Some key role changes there on the chart. This is where in 2 to 3 sites, we add the role of the campus pastor. It's also where we get into that matrix mindset of, all right, who owns what? Who decides what sets in? Mm-hmm. At 4 or more sites, this is where I would say we bring in a leader over the campus pastors. And this would be the time to actually bring a campus pastor for the sending location. I actually don't recommend bringing a campus pastor for the sending location in until you get over that hub of that 3rd location. And then lastly, this is probably just more of a warning, but when we have one site, we're hiring specialists for various ministry areas. When we get into 2 to 3 locations, now we're hiring more leaders. We're recognizing we have to hire more equipping, give ministry away leaders. But I also put on there this increased part-time staff. There is a tendency when you're in that 2 to 3 sites to just start hiring part-time people to plug holes because things are a little fractured, right? It's a little more complex. Yeah. The warning here, though, is that when you start to hire a bunch of part-time people, as you continue to grow, if they aren't part-timers who have leadership gifts, you're going to end up overstaffed, and you will have missed the opportunity to be raising those staff up for future leadership roles. And then, of course, once you get into full-on 4+ sites, you're really moving into that world of just hiring at campuses, and you're hiring those equipping leaders. Mm-hmm. The next one here, you asked a little bit about org charts, so let me pull that one up for you. This first org chart here is just a sample structure before a church launches into multi-site, these are the ministry lanes I often encourage them to get established at their one location. Because if we go to the second org chart here, as you begin to launch campuses, and again, this looks different for any church, but just the concept here, if you look at those solid lines and those dotted lines, you can tell that the dotted lines, we've got our central ministry strategists on that top line now. For example, in the weekend service, the Next Steps director, the family ministries director. They are going to solid line into their campus pastor. So that family ministry pastor will solid line in to their campus pastor, but there's going to be a dotted line relationship back to that central strategist. And then when you get to more locations and you get into 4 or more, this is the example of that multi-site director who now is leading campus pastors. And you've got the original location now has a campus pastor as well. And then all of those people who are reporting to the central strategists, those that are executing at that sending those that are executing at that sending location, who are executing ministry there, will actually move under and tuck under that campus pastor going forward. And so that's a really critical hire for your multi-site pastor, because that will most likely be the biggest people leader of anyone else on your staff. Because as we continue to go multi-site, we're typically not adding too much to the central side. We're adding to the campus location. So those solid line and dotted line things, we have more information in some of our articles on our website. But it's an important concept. If that's new to you, you want to make sure you get a grip on it before you go too further into multi-site. And the last thing I want to add as we're talking about these multi-site phases and the structure piece is just the math. We love math around here. We talk regularly about healthy churches staff one full-time equivalent for every 75 people they have on their average weekend attendance, 1 to 75. So when you get into staffing for multi-site, you have to add an additional layer to it. Meaning if you launch another location and you're going to send 500 people, you just can't divide 500 by 75 and send that many staff to the campus, because guess what? You have to cover central expenses now. You have to cover some of that overhead. So we use a 1.5 multiplier when we coach churches on staffing, meaning you have to take that 75 times 1.5, which I think is 112.5, and divide the 500 by that. That gives you a better ratio of how many staff you should be sending. And at the end of the day, you should end up with 66% of your staffing allocations for campus roles and about 33% of them for central roles.
Paul, just beyond the mechanics of how the structure best works with each new campus, could you speak to leadership specifically? How does the mindset of the leadership need to change? And are there other leadership aspects that you'd want to highlight at specific expansion points?
Yeah, so Sean, a couple things that Amy touched on that maybe I'll unpack a little bit more. That run from one location to like 4 locations, it's really common that churches simply can't financially afford to hire a central services team that supports those 2 or 3 campuses. In fact, even structurally, it doesn't even make a lot of sense. You might be able to operate, take the operations side of things like the finance, facilities, HR, IT, the core business function of the church, and begin centralizing that. You might be able to begin centralizing some of your content, like weekend content, or like your preaching, for example, may be delivered via video. And so whoever's preaching is preaching everywhere. So you can begin tinkering with that a little bit. But the reality is the team's not robust enough and financially strong enough yet to be able to start hiring a central services team. You usually start seeing that happen around 4 locations. There's a natural pressure that leads to that direction. That's kind of what wants to happen. And so kind of identifying those first among equals, so to speak. So who's your best, we'll pick on guest services for a second. Who's best at guest services on your team? And do they have the ability not just to do a great guest service, to drive a great guest services experience at the location they're at, but can they coach other people to do it too? And
Yeah.
so you're looking at those first among equals kind of people, not just the results they're producing at their locations, but their ability to lead through other people and coach other people principalistically. And so it's really common in that first, 2, 3, 4 locations that you're identifying this team that's kind of this ad hoc. You could formalize it if you'd like, but they're living on a campus, leading a campus team, and yet they're coaching in those principles at other locations at the same time. So this first among equals concept. It's a real normal progression as you go through this, what Amy is explaining to you guys with those org charts she was sharing. Another one is a little bit of a mind shift that happens. You talked about this, Amy, with the senior pastor. Sometimes the lead communicator can forget they're preaching to all these people on all these screens, right? In fact, today, more people meet Jesus through a screen at Sun Valley than through a communicator on stage live, which is... It's weird to wrestle that through with your mind, but it's producing so much spiritual fruit. And so helping the executive staff, the senior staff, whatever the language you want to place on that, to think through the original location. We've already used sending campus, original location, broadcast. These are all synonyms for this original location that where this church started. To begin viewing that location like a location. And behaving in your mind, and as you treat people, treat them the way you would treat any campus. So, for example, we had our offices at our original location. Our central team was on one side of the hallway. Our campus for that campus team was on the other side of the hallway. And particularly early on in our multi-site journey, it wasn't uncommon to hear things like, well, the Gilbert staff, they can just walk right across the hallway and talk to me or talk to Chad or talk to any number of central service team members. And so they have essentially an unfair advantage and access to the executive and central team. And so, and that's, we can kind of poo-poo that feeling and that emotion, but it's a real feeling and a real emotion. And if you ever had more than one kid, you understand this from a relational dynamic. And so it's important to just acknowledge it's a real feeling. We can't ignore it. And frankly, the original location needs us to treat them like a regular location. So people oftentimes they'll behave the way you treat them. So if you treat them like they're a failure, oftentimes there'll be failure type dynamics that emerge. If you treat them that they're successful and you talk to them in that kind of lens, it's amazing how they rise to the occasion. And so if you treat the original location, the staff there, like they're a campus of any other location, they'll begin drifting into that dynamic. And it's an important dynamic for them to drift into, because the larger you get, the more important it is to just treat them all like a campus.
Paul, can I jump in on that?
Sure.
I think just language is really important. It does create a picture. And if you're launching into your third or fourth campus and you're still saying main campus, you want to eliminate language like that. It's not, it's not the location, right? Main campus. That's right. Using words like broadcasting or sending campus neutralizes that feeling a little bit more. That don't use the mothership. That's probably another term that's out there. And it all fits in with what you're saying. We don't want to create through our words different favor for the different locations.
Right. Yeah. That's good.
Yeah, I mean, we use for our original location, it's located in Gilbert. We just call it our Gilbert location. You don't go to our website and say, ooh, where's the original site? It's just the Gilbert location. And when we talk about that with our staff, we call it the Gilbert location.
Yep.
So.
That's good. Very helpful. Okay, well, we're about to move on to the next part of our conversation. But before we do, we'd like to ask you to do some math. So we've included an equation in the workbook, and we want you to determine your current FTE, staff to attendance ratio. Do you know the percentage sitting in dual roles today? The percentage dedicated to central services alone? If not, that can be some of the homework that you can do after today's event. So we're going to give you about 30 seconds. Do the math located in your workbook, and we'll be back with conversation 3. Okay, so decision making is one of the things that gets trickier and trickier as multi-site churches continue to expand. And I hear about tensions between campus and central teams almost every time I talk with a multi-site church. Amy, what are some of the evidences that decision rights have become muddy or ineffective as a church has added more campuses?
Well, Sean, the key word there is just tension. That is one of the symptoms that you don't have something clear in your decision rights. I remember as an executive team, we had been working together, some of us, for many years, but we were adding new team members to that team as we added the multi-site director. And because decision rights were unclear, the relational tension between us was growing, meaning we were all kind of Mustangs wired to make calls, make it happen. And we started feeling like we can't make any decisions unless we're all in a room and we're all talking about it and disagreeing and coming to a consensus. So if you sense tension in the relationships of the team, that's one indication we probably don't have decision rights done well. Another tension that I see rise, and it's predictive of this as well, is when you start to hear the us and the they language, right? So my husband was a campus pastor for many years, and he actually had to coach his team, his campus team, to say, we never say us, we never say they. We are the same team, and we're going to show them, immense respect when our central counterparts come over to see us. But us and they, when we start saying they did this, they did that, they made that call, we probably have some funkiness in our decision rights matrix. Another big one is just drift and disunity. And we talk about this all the time when we are on the subject of multi-site. But you have to have clarity around who gets to make what decisions. And if you don't have that clarity and you have someone who is really entrepreneurial in that campus pastor role, if they aren't limited in what they can make decisions on, guess what they're going to do? They're going to start making decisions. They're going to start going, just veering off a little bit, not because they're bad people at all. They just want to reach their community and they might be trying new things. And what happens when decision rights aren't clear, this fracturing begins to happen between the campuses. And you don't notice it at first, but you said earlier, Paul, this doesn't feel like Sun Valley. If those fractures go on too far, it's not going to start to feel like one church in multiple locations. It's going to feel like three churches that are semi-related, but you're going to sense that drift. And then I think the last thing I would mention, just a symptom of decision rights are off, is if every decision really does start to just rise to your senior leadership team, meaning people don't feel equipped, they don't feel they have permission, they don't have clarity on how we make decisions. And so all of those are bubbling up into senior leadership team discussions.
Yeah. Paul, what are some of the best practices that you recommend for keeping decision rights clear, specifically as the complexity of the organization grows?
Yeah, so Sean, maybe a little more practically speaking, and some of what Amy was talking about, we're going to share a document with you that you're going to be able to work through here as a team. It's going to be incredibly helpful. It's funny how you get to a point where you actually have to make decisions about how you're going to make decisions. It sounds so weird, but you do. And let's be honest, we do in healthy marriages, we do this too. Early on, we talk about what's our budget going to be. And so we decide how we're going to spend our money before we get our money. So we're making decisions about how we're going to make decisions. This is normal. Church, by the way, God designed this whole thing to work the way it does. So it's no funny. It's not funny. It should operate any differently. So a couple of things. One, I think it's easier to give rope than it is to take it back. So particularly in those early days of multi-site, maybe your first couple of campuses, it's easier to keep things a little tighter to the vest, so to speak, when it comes to decision making, and then release decisions as you go on this journey. It feels awkward. Sometimes it feels hurtful when you give people the authority to make decisions and then you retract that and take it back. It can be confusing for teams and emotional. And so I think the biblical way to talk about this would be, hey, if you're faithful with a little, we're going to trust you with more. That'd be the kind of the biblical language. I think practically it's just easier to give rope than it is to take it back. So start here on your journey and then give rope as you can. Practically speaking, you got to remind people over and over and over
Hmm.
and over again. And you think that, hey, we're 4 locations, we've done this a bunch and we're good. This creeps up. This is a normal reoccurring thing to creep up every time you start a new location. And sometimes you may just be clipping along at 7 locations and all of a sudden you got to remind everybody, hold on, guys, this is how we do this. Yeah, we all have forgetters, and our forgetters work really well, and we need to remind people over and over. So you can train this. In fact, you should. In your onboarding, when you're bringing new team members on, there should be, whether you can, in a sophisticated way, they have a video that they can watch in their first couple of weeks of employment, and it checks off and it goes in their HR file, or you just personally train it. Hopefully you're doing some kind of marriage of the two. But you're training. This is how central services and the campuses work together. And this is who's making what decision. And this is who gets the actual decision authority and who gets to give input. Training those things is really important. And then, Amy, you alluded to this. Great leadership organizations and great leaders push decisions down. They don't pull them up. So I'm going to talk out of both sides of my mouth. It's going to sound that way for a second, but there is an art to this. It's just not all a science. Leaders learn to lead by being given permission to lead. So think about your early days as a leader. You were given some kind of runway and some kind of playing field to play within, and some kind of decisions you were allowed to make. And you learn to lead by leading, which means you're making decisions about things. And so if you want to make the decision about the color of the carpet, if you want to make decisions about what communion cups you're going to use, if you want to make decisions about every worship song, well, by all means, pull all that stuff up to you. But in Exodus 18, there's this conversation between Moses and his father-in-law, Jethro. And, Moses is all, busy, he's out of his mind, frustrated. And Jethro looks at his son-in-law and says, man, what you're doing, it's not good. You need to learn to push decisions down. And so the more you can push decisions down and the strategic directional decisions come to the senior leadership team, and a lot of the practical implementation goes to campus teams, you're going to live with one another in a lot more harmony. Your campus teams are going to feel like they actually have some runway to play within, as long as you define what the playing field is for them.
Yeah, that's so good. Well, we don't have time to cover it to today's webinar, but we've included in your workbook a framework for setting decision rights by ministry that we help churches learn to use when they go through our multi-site unstuck process. So I'm going to give you just a few seconds. What I'd like you to do is just comment with the word more in chat if you're interested in seeing an example of how that tool is used. And once you make that comment, we'll actually email you a broader tool after the event. So I'll give you just a few seconds to do that. Comment more in chat if you'd like that tool. And then we're back with the last conversation for today. All right, so Paul, we're hearing from so many churches lately about rapid growth, and I wonder if you could tee this conversation up. Why would a church need to add a campus quickly, add a campus fast? And is it possible to do that effectively? What decisions are most likely to end up getting a church stuck?
Yeah, it's a good question, Sean. I alluded to this earlier when I kind of just introduced myself and some of my past multi-site experience. The best reason to start a new multi-site location is because you have to. It's the very best reason to do this. And the reason you would have to is because you're growing, you have momentum, you've already learned how to do multiple services, you've already learned how to build a leadership bench, you're maximizing what the Lord's already entrusted to you, right? And so the best reason to do this is because you have to. The second best reason to do this is because you get to. In other words, we do have healthy finances. We do have healthy staffing. We do have a well-executed strategy where the book of Proverbs kind of thing, we're running the kingdom really well. And so that provides us the opportunity to begin to reach new people in a new location with a new campus. And so, is it possible to start a campus fast? Well, yeah, it's possible. Just like a young, unprepared married couple can adopt a teenager, right, and learn a lot of lessons the hard way. Um,
Yeah.
or they could go through 9 months of pregnancy together. They could prepare
Mhm.
the nursery. They could put together a crib. They can purchase the car seat, learn how to put the car seat in the car before you
Mhm.
go to the hospital. The diapers, like even emotionally preparing for the birth of that child and welcoming that new child into your home. There's a lot that goes through your life and your heart and your mind as you're going through those 9 months together.
Mhm.
So can you launch a new campus fast? Sure you can. But you can launch fast or you could launch strong. It's really difficult to do both of those things, Sean.
Mm.
Sometimes an opportunity is just an opportunity. You may have
Mhm.
momentum at your original location, and someone may come along with an opportunity to maybe do a merger. It's
Mhm.
quite common for that to be the first one out of the gate. Amy,
Sure.
you alluded to that in your story.
Yeah.
Sometimes an opportunity is just an opportunity. You really need to discern: is this a word from the Lord? Is this a burning bush moment, a Book of Acts dream where the Holy Spirit says to Paul, "Go over there," or is it just an opportunity?
Mhm.
And we have a spiritual responsibility to steward the leadership the Lord's entrusted to us at our original location before jumping into this thing. So you mentioned, can we do it and how do churches get stuck? I'd say a couple of things on the stuck side of things as they're starting new locations fast. Overextending yourself. Again, this is true in life relationally. It's also true in organizations and churches. Overextending yourself. All of a sudden, we've gone from 1 to 2 to 3 too fast, and we've overextended ourselves financially,
Mhm.
staffing, and oftentimes that can lead through to demulti-siting, which, by the way, you've seen a lot of that happen out of COVID.
Mhm.
Uh, we'll talk
Mhm.
more about that a little bit. I'll allude to that. Not launching strong enough. Amy, you talked about this earlier. I think it's really important. I think our general rule of thumb and recommendations: wait till that original location gets to at least 1,000 people in average attendance before you have the strength to launch strong enough.
Mhm.
And choosing the wrong leader. For example, if you want to deliver teaching via video because you believe culture is replicated through the stage and what happens in that teaching, it's not just communicating God's word, you're also building culture through the stage. If you have a different communicator, you may end up with a different church.
Mhm.
Not always, but often. And then
Yeah.
choosing the wrong location, I think, is another one. We're growing. We feel the pressure to go fast. And so we got to get something to
Mhm.
market quick. And so sometimes we can choose physical locations where they don't quite have the room that we need it to have. They don't have the right ancillary space with kids and lobby space to support what's happening in the auditorium. Maybe they don't have the right amount of parking. And we create a different problem for ourselves by moving too fast. Sometimes it's just the wrong real estate. It's
Mhm.
cheap and it's available, and there might be a reason it's cheap and available. It may, really, it might be the wrong real
Yeah.
estate. You got to remember location, location, location. It really does matter.
Mhm.
And then something that people don't talk about a lot, but I'll just allude to here quickly: when choosing the wrong location, sometimes it's in the wrong culture. So I think you need to be sober minded with yourself. What I mean by that is God has designed you and the leadership gifting he's entrusted to you and the team at your church to be able to do ministry in such a way you probably do a really good job reaching a certain kind of people. Maybe it's young
Mhm.
families, maybe it's an urban setting, maybe it's a suburban setting, maybe it's a metropolitan setting, and you know how to do that really well. Going into a different culture, like if you're an urban church and you're like, we're gonna do a campus in the suburbs, it's a different culture.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think sometimes churches, again, they feel pressure to start a new location fast because they're growing, and they can fail to ask themselves the right kinds of questions and ends up kind of painting themselves into a corner.
Mhm.
Amy, anything else that you'd add to that?
Yeah, first, Paul, as you were speaking, it just kind of occurred to me. Um, if you're building a new building to launch a new location, you aren't going to go too fast because that process in and of itself slows you down and gives you time for planning because you need architecture, really building permits. But when you have what you called the opportunity of either an existing building or a church that calls and wants to merge with you, those are the ones that go too fast. And those are the ones that when you talked about overextending yourself, choosing the wrong leader, the wrong location, those are big deals with multi-site if you make wrong calls in those areas. And so just as a way to kind of put a yellow flag up there for those of you who are participating with us today, if you're considering an existing building or considering a merger, just heed some of these things we're talking about when it comes to moving too fast into a multiple location. So I want to go back, Paul, to what you said, talking about choosing your location. When a church has appropriate timeframes to plan for a new location, we walk through what we call 7 key success factors to choosing the best location. But when you have to launch in this condensed time frame, I lean into 2 of those. The first one is make sure you have a core group of people that live in the community where you are going to put your church. That is one of the biggest success factors for multi-site. Because as you said, Paul, people transfer culture, but you need people to serve at that church. You need people to help new believers grow up, be leaders in your discipleship pathway. You don't want a core group of people to go for 6 months and then come back to the original location. You need them to be committed to that location. So don't go to a community where you don't have any people currently coming from. And then second, don't choose a location that's too close to the sending location. Over time, that will become a big problem. You want to live in that 20 to 30 minute drive time window as much as you can. It's important because, again, if we launch quick, maybe we don't have all of our I's dotted and T's crossed. So it's not a perfect Sun Valley replication like we're talking about earlier, Paul. People are consumers and they're going to do it for a while because it's on mission. And then if it's too close, they're going to come on back. And if they also don't live there, that's even more motivation to come back to the sending location. So that's one of them for me. I would also say if you have to launch fast, send a seasoned team. Send a team of people. Don't hire like we ended up doing with this option and send out a brand new team with a brand new leader. You want to send people staff-wise who know your culture and your brand. Third thing I'd say briefly, like we're talking, clarify your decision rights up front. Prevent yourself from predictable conflict by getting people in a room, probably a couple of different meetings to at least get high-level decision rights defined. Write them down, take everything you know in your head and write them down so those teams have clarity. Mm-hmm. And lastly, if you have to go fast, and especially, I even hate to say this, Paul, you know my heart. If this is your first launch, I really don't want you to go fast. I would say pass on the opportunity till you can plan. But if you have to, for whatever reason, start practicing the technology of multi-site now. Growing churches do this naturally. Like you said, Paul, they add services. Sometimes they have to add venues on their location. They're learning how to grab camera shots. They're learning how to look into the camera when they're teaching. You do not want to launch a location and have the technology falter because, again, it's going to set it up poorly for success.
One of the things you mentioned in there, Amy, I just want to touch on before we move on, Sean, you talked about the 20 to 30 minute rule of thumb, which there's a reason why that rule of thumb exists. It's true. But there are ways you can break that rule in different markets because of population density. Yes. You can actually break that rule. Sometimes there are emotional barriers with certain highways or lakes or mountain ranges that you're like, oh, you live south of the 202? Why would you ever go north of the 202? Right. So we have a couple of campuses that are actually only about 10 minutes away from each other, and it works because there's emotional boundaries like highways, and there's also population density that, people just, they don't go to the movie theater on that side of the 202. They go on the movie theater on this side of the 202. Sure. So be thoughtful about the way people do life in the community that you're in.